The nursing home aide called my grandfather the quiet man, and I just nodded like I understood what that meant. This is not the story you think about a grandson discovering his grandfather was a war hero all along. I want to tell you about Harold James Kowalski, who worked at the Ford plant in Dearborn, Michigan for 42 years. By my own honest accounting, Harold was the kind of man who could sit in a room for hours without saying a single word. He wasn't cold, he just had a stillness, a silence that felt like a wall between him and the rest of the world. I grew up believing he was just a tired old man who had nothing left to say to anyone anymore. I carried that belief into my own adult life, and it cost me a relationship with a woman I truly loved. My ex-girlfriend Sarah said I was emotionally unavailable, and that I had learned it from watching my grandfather. When my grandmother passed in 2008, he didn't cry, he just sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall. I told myself he was incapable of feeling anything deeply, just a shell of a man going through the motions. I worked as a high school history teacher in Detroit, making $43,000 a year. I told my students that World War II was a conflict of immense suffering and unimaginable human courage. But I never once mentioned my grandfather because I assumed he had been a cook or a driver or something ordinary. If you have ever felt like you didn't really know the people who raised you, please subscribe and stay with me. I remember visiting him at the Oakwood Heights nursing home on West Outer Drive in Detroit. He was 92 years old, and he had been there for 3 years after his stroke in 2019. The staff loved him because he never complained, never asked for anything, just sat quietly in his chair. They called him the quiet man, and they meant it as a compliment, a sign of his gentle nature. I visited him every Sunday, and we would sit together for an hour without exchanging more than a few words. I thought I knew everything about him because he had never given me any reason to think otherwise. He had a small room with a window that faced the parking lot and a photograph of my grandmother on the nightstand. His hands were gnarled from decades of working on assembly lines at the Ford Rouge plant. He had a Purple Heart in a dusty box on his dresser that I assumed he had bought at a garage sale. I asked him about it once, and he said, "It's nothing," and changed the subject to the weather outside. I stopped asking questions because I didn't want to upset him or make him feel uncomfortable. When he died in January of 2024, I was the one who had to go through his belongings at the nursing home. That is where I found the military file, tucked behind his dresser, hidden from view for over 70 years. The file was stamped, classified, and it had a red stripe across the front that made my hands start to shake. I opened it, and I saw the words Silver Star and Valor and Enemy Engagement, and I couldn't breathe. The file said that Harold Kowalski had been a scout in the 3rd Infantry Division in Europe during World War II. He had volunteered for a mission in 1944 to rescue a squad of soldiers trapped behind enemy lines in France. The file contained official commendations from General Patton himself, dated November 1944. It said he had crawled through enemy fire for over 2 miles to lead 12 men to safety. He had been shot in the leg and the shoulder, but he kept going because he refused to leave anyone behind. The file said he had personally carried a wounded soldier on his back for over a mile to the evacuation point. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor, but the paperwork was lost, and he never received it. He received the Silver Star instead, and he never told anyone about it, not even his own wife or children. I sat on the floor of his room with the file in my hands, and I realized I had no idea who my grandfather was. He wasn't the quiet old man who never spoke. He was a hero who had chosen to never speak about his heroism. I remembered all the times I had judged him for his silence, for his inability to express emotion. I remembered all the times I had assumed he was just a simple man with nothing important to say. Researchers have found that a significant percentage of veterans choose never to discuss their combat experiences. My grandfather was one of them, and I had spent 41 years judging him for a choice I didn't understand. I called my father, who lived in a small house on Livernois Avenue, and I asked him if he knew about the file. My father said, "I knew he had some medals, but he never talked about it, and I never asked him about it." I realized that my father had also been raised in the same silence, the same wall of quiet that surrounded Harold. I went back to the nursing home, and I asked the staff if they knew anything about my grandfather's military service. The head nurse, a woman named Diane, told me that Harold had saved a patient from choking on her food last year. She said he had moved faster than anyone expected and performed the Heimlich maneuver like he had done it before. She said he never mentioned it, just sat back down and went back to being the quiet man, as if nothing had happened. I realized that his silence wasn't a lack of love, it was a choice to carry his burdens without burdening anyone else. I drove to the cemetery where my grandmother was buried, and I stood at her grave with the file in my hands. I told her that I finally understood why Harold was the way he was, and I wished I had known it sooner. I told her that I was sorry for all the years I had assumed he was just a tired, empty man with nothing to give. The silence wasn't an absence, it was a shield, and he had been protecting everyone from the weight of what he had seen. I started researching my grandfather's unit, and I found a veterans organization that had records of his mission. They sent me a copy of the official after-action report, which described his actions in detail. The report said he had exposed himself to enemy fire repeatedly to draw attention away from his trapped comrades. It said he had been wounded 3 times but refused medical evacuation until everyone else had been treated. I held that report in my hands, and I felt tears streaming down my face for the man I never truly knew. I didn't need to post anything on social media or try to get him a posthumous Medal of Honor or any recognition. I just needed to carry his story in my heart and let it change how I see him and how I see myself. I started reading books about veterans and their experiences, trying to understand the weight he carried for so long. Studies suggest that many veterans of World War II returned home and never spoke of their service to anyone at all. They simply went back to work, raised families, and carried their memories in silence for the rest of their lives. My grandfather was one of those men, and I had been too busy judging his silence to see the depth of his sacrifice. I thought about all the times I had wished he would talk more, show more emotion, be more like other grandfathers. I thought about all the times I had felt rejected by his silence, when he was probably just trying to protect me. He had seen things that no human being should ever see, and he chose to keep those horrors locked away inside him. He chose to be the quiet man, because speaking would have opened a door he had closed over 70 years ago. I drove to the nursing home one last time to collect the rest of his belongings from his small, quiet room. I found a folded American flag that had been sitting in the back of his closet, untouched for decades. It was the flag that had been presented to his family at his father's funeral in 1952, and he had kept it safe. I found a photograph of him in uniform, a young man with a strong jaw and eyes that looked older than his years. He looked nothing like the frail, silent man I had known, and yet he was exactly the same person underneath. I realized that I had been measuring him by my own expectations, my own need for words and emotion and expression. But he had been loving us in the only way he knew how, by protecting us from the darkness he carried inside. The National Council on Aging reports that many older adults experience isolation because their histories go unspoken. My grandfather was one of them, and I was too busy being frustrated to see that his silence was a gift. I placed his silver star in a shadow box and hung it on my wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of quiet strength. I started talking to my high school students about him, telling them the story of a man who never bragged about his heroism. I told them that courage doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it looks like a man sitting quietly in a chair. I told them that being underestimated is not the same as being weak, and quiet proof outlasts loud cruelty. I told them that my grandfather had saved 12 lives in 1944, and he had never told a soul about it. My students asked me questions about him, and I realized that his story was now being carried forward by others. I realized that his legacy wasn't in the medals he never showed, but in the life he lived without seeking recognition. He had been a hero in a war, a hero in his family, and a hero in his silence, and I finally understood all of it. I visited his grave on the anniversary of his death, and I placed a single white rose on the headstone. I told him I was sorry for not understanding him when he was alive, and I thanked him for his sacrifice. I told him that I finally understood why he was called the Quiet Man, and that I was proud to call him my grandfather. I walked away from that grave feeling lighter than I had ever felt before, because I finally knew the truth. The truth was that my grandfather had loved us all deeply, but he had loved us so much that he couldn't speak of his pain. He had carried the weight of war so that we wouldn't have to, and that was the greatest act of love I could ever imagine. I don't need to tell the whole world about his heroism or demand that he receive any posthumous recognition. I just need to carry his story in my heart, tell it to my children, and honor his memory by living with quiet dignity. I think about him now, sitting in his chair at the nursing home, looking out the window at the parking lot. I used to think he was just waiting to die, but now I know he was just sitting with his memories, alone with his ghosts. He had saved lives, taken lives, witnessed horrors, and he had chosen to carry that weight without asking for help. That is a strength I will never fully understand, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to honor it. I tell my students that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear work uniforms and sit in quiet rooms. I tell them that the most important stories are often the ones that are never told by the people who lived them. And I tell them about Harold James Kowalski, my grandfather, who was called the quiet man at the home. Who in your life turned out to be someone you didn't expect, and who carried a weight you never knew existed.